Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session on ReactJS questions and answers regarding the interview. So in this session, we are going to cover frequently asked interview questions on ReactJS. So let us start with the first question itself. So what is React? Now, ReactJS is an open source JavaScript library which is used for creating the user interface for single page applications. It is used for managing the view layer for web and mobile applications. Now, when I say like single page application, basically it means that your application is like it's a web application or website that interacts with user by dynamically rewriting the current web page with new data from the web server instead of default method by which web browser load the entire page. Okay, I think you must be able to understand. So basically in a single page application, what happens? A page refresh never occurs. Instead, whatever HTML, JavaScript or CSS code is required, it is either retrieved by the browser with a single page load or the appropriate resources are dynamically loaded and added to the page as necessary, usually in response to the user action. So ReactJS is one such library which is used to create single page applications. And to be honest, this is in very huge demand nowadays. So with that, let's move on to the next question. What are pure components? Now, basically, pure components in ReactJS, that is React.pure component, is exactly the same as React component, except that it handles the should component update method for you. Now, in ReactJS, you might be aware that should component update lifecycle method, it is basically used to customize the default behavior and implement when the React component should re-render or update itself. Now, with this pure component, if we extend a class with a pure component, there is no need for should component update lifecycle method. So what exactly happens is, in ReactJS pure component, the class compares current state and props with new props and states to decide whether the React component should re-render itself or not. Let us go with one small example. Now, we have this code. It extends React.pure component. Now, inside the render method, I'm gonna add this return statement wherein I'm returning H1. Welcome to tutorial. Yes. constructor. Now, if you take a look at the code, I have extended our class test. Say, for example, we have a class test, and it is extending from react.pureComponent, and then inside render method, I have written my HTML code, JSX code. So here what happens, if I talk about the pure component, typically in ReactJS, we have should component update lifecycle method. So instead of that, the functionality of this particular lifecycle method is achieved here. So the ReactJS pure component class, what it does is it does a brief comparison between the current state and props with new props and decide to render whether the component should re-render itself or not. So this is one basic example of pure component. Then moving on to the next question, what is state in React? Now this is one of the, so to say, most frequently asked questions, like what is state in ReactJS? Now, state of a component is an object that holds some information that may change over the lifetime of the component. So, in other words, the state is actually a built-in React object. It is used to contain the data or information about the component. So basically, when we deal with a component, its state can change over time. Whenever it does change, the component re-renders. The change in state can happen as a response to user action or system-generated events, and these changes determine the behavior of the component and how it will re-render. So let me give you a small example of a state. Okay. Now, after defining the state, say for example, I have a method update name where I will update the state. Now inside the render method, I will put the return statement. And inside that, I'll put my JSX. So here, basically, what is happening? Say, for example, I have one class, greetings. It is extending react.component. Now here I am having my state. Okay. So by default, it is having, say, the name as world. Now, I want to update this name. So how to do that? So whenever we're gonna update the state, we cannot do it directly. We use the method setState. So for example, I have one method called as update name. So inside that, I'm using setState to update the name. And this is my JSX wherein we have written the code. So this was a brief idea about state. Moving on to the next question. What are props in React? Just as we have state, we do have props. So basically props are inputs to components. They are single values or objects containing a set of values that are passed to components on creation using a naming convention, which is pretty much similar to HTML tag attributes. Now, in short, we can say that props are arguments which are passed into React components. So, for example, there is an element called as car. Now, I want to add one brand attribute. So how do we write? We write const element is equal to car brand as Ford. But if we want to use the brand attribute in the component, so how can we do that? So I have a function and that is car, and I am passing the props. So inside this, I'll return my element as I am a, so inside this, I'll put props dot brand. So now I'll put the exclamation mark. So here, instead of, hard coding the brand name, what we are doing is we are passing it as an attribute or a props here. So whenever I want to execute this, it will take the brand name which is passed as props. So this was all about props. Moving on to the next question. So what is the difference between state and props? Now that we know what is a state and what is a prop, it is very much important to understand the basic difference between props and state in ReactJS. So basically, props get passed to the component similar to the function parameters, whereas state is managed within the component similar to variables declared within a function. So basically, props are read-only. It means when I say props get passed to the component familiar to function parameter, it means that props are read-only. We can't change it. On the other hand, state is dynamic. It can change. Props are immutable, whereas state is mutable. Props allow you to pass data from one component to other component as an argument, whereas state holds the information about the components. One more difference I would like to highlight is props can be accessed by the child component, whereas state cannot be accessed by child components. Props are basically used to communicate between components, whereas states can be used for rendering the dynamic changes with the component. Stateless component can have props, whereas stateless components cannot have state. Props make components reusable. State cannot make components reusable. Props are external and controlled by whatever renders the component. On the other hand, state is internal and controlled by the React component itself. So these are the basic differences between state and props. Now, moving on to the next question. How to bind methods or event handlers in JSX? So this is a very interesting question. So when we deal with ReactJS, basically, we deal with components. Now, when a user interacts with any kind of component, what happens? Event is triggered. Now here we will try to understand what are the various ways to manage the event handlers in JSX. So there are 3 ways to achieve this. One is binding in constructor. Second one is public class field syntax. And third one is arrow functions in callback. Now binding in constructor. So in JavaScript classes, the methods are not bound by default. The same thing applies for React event handlers defined as class methods. So normally what happens, we bind them in constructor. So I will explain this using one small example. Then we will define our render method. This is our button. Okay. Now, if you take a look at the code, we have a class which extends the component. So in the constructor, after super props, we have written the statement, this dot handle click is equal to this dot handle click dot bind dot this. So this is one of the way in which we bind using constructor. Going back to the presentation, we have another way is public class field syntax. So if you don't like to bind in this way, then you can use public class field syntax, which can be used to correctly bind the callback. Now, I can give a small example. Let's remove this. Now we have our own button component. Okay. This dot handle click. So we will pass it like click me. Okay. Now, this is one way using public class. We can basically, define this handle click and bind it. Now the third one is arrow function. So this is pretty much similar. I have used it already here. Just that instead of declaring it like implementing it using normal function, you can use arrow notation. So these are the three ways to achieve binding. Now moving on to the next question. What are synthetic events in ReactJS? So synthetic events are like cross-browser wrapper around the browser's native event. So talking about this in detail, I'd like to highlight. We have synthetic event in JS. So when we talk about the synthetic event in JavaScript, so basically these are event objects that are created by the JavaScript programmer as opposed to real events that come into picture. Now talking about the same context here in ReactJS, synthetic event basically is like a wrapper that forms the part of React's event system. So your event handlers will be passed as instances of synthetic event across browser wrapper around the browser's native event. It has the same interface as the browser's native event, including stop propagation, prevent default, except the events work identically across all browser. So this was basically a small overview of synthetic event. Next, we have what are forward refs. So ref forwarding is a feature that lets some components take a ref they receive and pass it further down to a child. So talking about practical use, say for example, you have a component button. Okay. Now you want to inherit the features of a button and you want to create another component out of it, say responsive button, which has all the features of a button, and in addition to it, you have certain other features like when you change the screen width, the appearance should also change. I mean, you are trying to make it responsive. So what will happen is, in normal button, say you have n number of attributes and you want that those attributes should be forwarded to the child component. Okay, so then what happens? You can add it as ref. Once you add it as ref, what happens? Those features will be accessible by the child components. So this is what we know about ref forwarding. Next question. What is virtual DOM? Now, virtual DOM is basically an in-memory representation of the real DOM. So in ReactJS, what happens? We have a web page, okay? And in that particular web page, we have a number of components. So when we talk about virtual DOM, it's basically a lightweight JavaScript representation of the actual DOM, which is used in frameworks like React. So what happens is, updating the virtual DOM is faster than updating the actual DOM. So there is a concept of diffing algorithm, which is used internally. What happens is, when you interact with a component and you update certain feature, so instead of reloading the entire page, only the part which has been updated, that is kind of re-rendered. There is a comparison between the initial DOM copy and the updated one, and only those differences, those things which are modified, that gets rendered. So this is basically the idea about virtual DOM. Now, again, next question, how virtual DOM works? As I told in my previous discussion, whenever any underlying data changes, the entire UI is re-rendered in the virtual DOM representation. So basically what happens is, using diffing algorithm, it compares the previous in-memory presentation of the DOM and the one which is updated. So the part that is updated, only that particular portion is rendered. So this is all about virtual DOM. Now coming to the next question, what are controlled components? So now, control component means a component that controls the input elements within the forms on subsequent user input is known as control components in ReactJS. In short, these are the components in which the form data is handled by the component's state. Forms are used to store the information in a document section, and the information from this form is typically sent to a server to perform an action. So here what happens, each form element, it contains a value. The value may be typed or selected by the user or browser. When the element's value is changed, I mean triggered by the act of typing or selecting, it is updated accordingly. Now, moving on to the next question. What are uncontrolled components? So uncontrolled components are the ones that store their own state internally, and you query the DOM using a ref to find its current value when you need it. This is basically similar to traditional HTML. here what happens, the form data is handled by the DOM itself. As I told, it maintains their own state and will be updated only when the input value changes. To write an uncontrolled component, there is no need to write an event handler for every state update. As discussed, we can use a ref to access the value of the form from the DOM. Moving on to the next question. What is lifting state up in React? So when several components need to share the same changing data, then it is recommended to lift the shared state up to their closest common ancestor. Now, why this is important? Because see, for example, we have deeply nested components and we are going to use same changing data. Then if it is placed at a location which is quite common to all the components, it makes it a bit easy to access the data. So for that purpose, it is suggested to lift the state up in React. Now, moving on to the next part, which is very important. In most of the interviews, you will face this question. What are the lifecycle methods of React? This question is very much generic, and in most of the interviews, this is asked. Now, when I talk about lifecycle methods in React, so let me explain. The React lifecycle is comprised of basic three phases: mounting, updating, and unmounting. So mounting means putting elements into the DOM. So here there are 4 built-in methods: constructor, get derived state from props, render, component, did mount. So render method, as you know, is required and will always be called. Get derived state from props. Then other methods are optional. It depends. Now, after mounting, the next phase is updating. This phase comes into picture when the component is updated. Now, a component is updated when there is a change in the component's state or props. So here we have 5 built-in methods. These are get derived state from props, should component update, get snapshot before update, component did update, etc. Now, after updation, the next phase is unmounting. Now, next phase or unmounting come into picture when the component is removed from the DOM. So here we have only one method, that is component will unmount. With this, we understood what is lifecycle in ReactJS and what are the various phases of lifecycle and what are the important methods in ReactJS which are part of this lifecycle. Next question is, what is context? Now, context provides a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at each and every level. So, context is basically, it is designed to share data that can be considered global for a tree of React components, such as current authenticated user, theme, or preferred language. Okay, so say for example, we manually thread through a theme prop in order to style the button component. Okay, so this is very important because what happens is suppose we are dealing with a very complicated component tree and it is kind of little bit deep down nested. So in that case, passing data becomes very difficult. So to avoid that, we use context. And for that purpose, we have context API, which consists of various other components like react.createContext, context.provider, context.consumer, and class.contextType. This was all about context. Moving on to the next question. What is children prop? So children is a prop that allow you to pass components as data to other component just like any other prop you use. Say for example, there is a parent component and there is a child component. So using children as a prop, we can pass the components in the form of data to other components, as a result of which it eases the communication between different components. Next, we have what are stateless components. Now, if the behavior is independent of its state, then it can be a stateless component. So this is also a very important question which you face in the interviews. So when I talk about stateless components, these are the components which don't have any state at all, which means we can't use this dot set state inside these components. These are like normal function with no render method. They don't have lifecycle. So it is not possible to use the lifecycle methods as component did mount and other hooks which we have. Moving on to the next question. Now, just as we have stateless components, we do have stateful components as well. Now, a stateful component is a component that holds some state. So, the basic difference between stateful and stateless component, if I say, then stateless components are simple functional component without having a local state. But stateful component, they contain obviously their own state object and event handling function, user action, etc. as well. So this was the basic detail about stateless components and stateful components and what is the basic difference between them. Now, what are error boundaries in React? Error boundaries are components that catch JavaScript errors anywhere in their component tree, log those errors, and display a fallback UI instead of the component tree that crashed. For example, I have a component and by any chance, I encountered some error. So if a user is interacting with my application and at that particular point of time, my component has crashed, the page will not load properly. It will throw some error and the UI would look very different. So to avoid that, instead of throwing some error, what we do is using error boundary, we display a fallback UI instead of the component tree, which has crashed, of course, and display some message. So this was all about error boundary in ReactJS. Moving on to the next question. Okay, this question is a little bit tricky. What will happen if you use setstate in constructor? So it seems to be a little tricky, and sometimes in interview, they do ask this question. So when you use set state, then apart from assigning to the object state, React also re-renders the component and all its children. So if you take a look at the question, it is asking like, what will happen if you use set state in constructor? So normally set state is used for updating the state, right? So if we use the set state inside a constructor, what will happen? So like basic purpose is to assign to the object state. Apart from this, again, all the components, all the children, everything will re-render. So that is the answer you can say. Moving on to the next question. What will happen if you use props in initial state? So this is a little bit tricky. So if the props on the component are changed without the component being refreshed, then the new prop value will never be displayed because the constructor function will never update the current state of the component. The initialization of the state from props only runs when the component is first created. So let me explain you through some example that will help you to understand this. Say, for example, I have a class, my component Now here I will put my render method. Okay. Let me put it around the curly braces. Okay. So here what we are doing is we have a state. Inside that we have this input value which we are using. And then inside render method, if we are using it in this way, it is not going to, display the updated input value. If we use the props inside the render method, then it will update the value. So I'll remove this. And here I will put it as props. Now, if we use it in this format, it will update the value. Let me go back to the slide. This question is covered. So what will happen if we use props in initial state? What will happen is, if the props on the component are changed without the component being refreshed, new prop value will not be displayed. So what we do is, we have to use the props here in the return, like while we are passing on this, then only the value will be updated. Moving on to the next question. How do you conditionally render components? This is also a very important question. And when you work with components, you might come across such scenarios where you have to render a component conditionally. For example, there is a flag called as isResponsive. If that isResponsive flag is true, then I have to render component A, or else I will render component B. So now in some cases, you want to render different components depending on some state, as I told. So JSX does not render false or undefined. In that case, we can use short circuiting method, process, to render a given part of your component only if a certain condition is true. So here we can take help of ternary operator, and accordingly we can display the component. As I told, suppose isResponsive is a flag and it is meant to be true. If it is true, then A will be rendered, or else B will be rendered. Moving on to the next question. What are hooks? So nowadays, in most of the interviews, you will find interviewers are keen on testing your knowledge on hooks. So hooks are a recent addition or new feature which was kind of added into ReactJS. So basic purpose of hook is it allows the function components to have access to state and other React features. So normally, when I talk about class components, we have n number of features, like they have their own lifecycle methods, etc., etc. But suppose you are writing a functional component and there is a requirement wherein you have to implement certain functionality which is quite similar to the lifecycle method. So how to do that? For that purpose, hooks are new feature. They let you use all other features of React without writing a class. Although hooks generally replace class components, but there are no plans to remove classes from React as of now. So in short, hooks allow you to hook into the React features such as state and lifecycle methods. Now there are 3 rules for hooks I would like to highlight. Hooks can be called inside the React functional components. Hooks can be called at the top level of a component, and hooks cannot be conditional. So whenever you are dealing with any kind of hook, you have to keep in mind these 3 rules. And there are some inbuilt hooks which are present, like use state, use effect hooks. But apart from this, you can also create your own hook, which are known as custom hooks. This was all about hook. Moving on to the next question. Is it mandatory to define constructor for React component? No, it is not mandatory. It means that if you don't initialize the state and you don't bind methods, you don't need to implement a constructor for your React component. It depends on your choice. However, this is not completely hard and fast rule to follow this approach. Moving on to the next question. What are limitations with HOC? Now, when I talk about HOC, it means higher order components in ReactJS. Now, HOC is an advanced technique in React for reusing the component logics. HOC are not part of the React API, but these are like patterns which emerge from React's compositional nature. So basically, these are kind of what I can say, advanced technique for using logic in React. So it is HOC basically incorporate the don't repeat yourself or drive principle of programming, which you might have used or you might have heard. So it is one of the best known principle of software development, though. So though it sounds to be very good, but it has its own limitation. Don't use HOCs inside the render method. Static method must be copied over. Refs aren't passed though through. So these are the three limitations of higher order components. So when I talk about don't use HOCs inside the render method, it means that it is not recommended to apply a HOC to a component within the render method of a component. So if we do that, then the performance is like affected by remounting a component, which causes state of that component and all of its children to be lost. And static methods must be copied over. So when you apply a HOC to a component, the new component does not have any of the static methods of the original component. This is one disadvantage. And refs aren't passed through. So for HOCs, you need to pass through all props to the wrapped component. But this does not work for refs. This is because ref is not really a prop similar to key. So in that case, you can use React Forward Ref API, which we have discussed in the previous slide. Now, moving on to the next question. When component props default to true? This is an interesting question. So the answer to it will be, if you pass no value for a prop, it defaults to true. And this behavior is available so that it can match the behavior of the HTML. Moving on to the next question, which is very interesting. How do you pass an event handler to a component? So the answer to this question is little bit interesting. So you can pass the event handler and other functions as prop to the child component. Say for example, I have one parent component and there is a child component, and there is an event handler. So how do I do that? How do I pass the event handler? Whatever event handler you have or any other function you have, you can pass it as props to the child component. Once it is passed to the child component, then you can carry on with your further logic implementation. Now, coming to the next question. How do you say that props are read-only? So So the answer to this is when you declare a component as a function or a class, it must never modify its own props. That makes sense. It cannot modify its own props if you declare any component as a function or a class. So if it is not having that so-called, it is not having any option to modify the props, then it means that props are immutable, which absolutely makes sense to say that props are read-only. Now, moving on to the next question. How to prevent component from rendering, re-rendering, I can say. So this question is very common. The answer to this is you can prevent component from rendering by returning null based on specific condition. This way, it can conditionally render the component. You might have remembered I told in the previous slide that there is should component update method, and we do have a feature called as conditional rendering. So if we pass null or such kind of value, specifically null, then obviously the condition is not met here. So it makes sense that the component will not render. So this is one of the way wherein we can prevent the component from rendering or stop the component from rendering. Moving on to the next part. How to fetch data with React hooks. Now the effect hook that we use, known as use effect hook, basically is used to fetch the data with Axios from the API and to set the data in the local state of the component with the state hooks update function. So Axios, if I want to explain it here in simple way, it is kind of lightweight HTTP client based on the HTTP service. Okay, so Axios is basically used. It's kind of library which serves to create HTTP requests that are present externally. So for that purpose, we use Axios. So now suppose you have a component and you are making call to the backend, okay, to fetch the data. Now, okay, you have the data with you and accordingly your component state will be updated. So this kind of functionality can be achieved using use effect hook. In the previous slides, I have explained what is React hook. So use effect is one kind of a hook which helps us to achieve this functionality. Moving on to the next slide, like we don't have anything, and I think this is the end. So we have covered quite a lot of questions in this session. And thank you everyone for watching this. All the best for your interview.